So our next and final speaker for the symposium is Elizabeth DeLoughrey, who is associate professor in the Department of English at UCLA. We'll have two discussants after that. So, did you have PowerPoint? Yes, you do. Is it all set?
We'll see if it works.
Where? Okay.
All right. So first, let me thank Ken. Thanks so much for the invitation to come here. Thank you, all of you, for being here on a Friday afternoon during a very busy time in the semester. Thank you, Pat, for all the amazing things you've done, including finding my reading glasses, to all the logistics, to getting here. Thank you so much. It's been a really exhilarating day, and I hope this presentation works. I'm new to Prezi, so we'll see. Okay, allow. Okay, great. So I begin with our Earth island, an extraterritorial view of the planet made possible by the satellite technologies developed in the Cold War. A battle that, while largely invisible to the majority of the people of the globe, was violently propagated on the small atolls in the great ocean of the Pacific. As I've argued elsewhere, the myth of the island isolate, adopted by ecologists and anthropologists alike, helped to justify the detonation of hundreds of thermonuclear weapons in the atolls of the Marshall Islands and French Polynesia. Forged out of a discourse of isolation and remoteness, which are not synonymous, the logic of these tests, like militarization discourse in general, was filled with paradoxes. In selecting the atolls for nuclear detonations, the island was treated as metonymic of the globe. Blowing up the island, and they blew up many, I'll give you one example here of Lab. This is a 6,200 wide foot crater created by the first thermonuclear weapon detonated on the planet named Mike. So blowing up the island was understood in a part-for-whole relationship in which one could make predictions for the destruction and irradiation of the entire Earth. And here's the Bravo crater. This is the 15 megaton hydrogen weapon. Bravo detonated in 1954, and all of us who are born after 1954 carry the irradiation in our bones. So, however, even though the Pacific Islands were used as laboratories and were at the vanguard of new technologies of weaponry, high-speed cameras, color film, radiocarbon dating, developments in ecology, in biology, and oceanography, and that produced the first environmental refugees, the islands were interpolated as remote, isolated, and primitive, as the many Atomic Energy Commission films of the time attested. I'll just give you one. I'm more interested in showing the after effects than the kind of spectacular images of the weapons, but this will just give you one image. This is George from Operation Greenhouse, again using islands as a kind of contained space or interpolating them in that way. Nisology, the study of islands, has long been concerned with this paradox in which to continentals, tropical islands are depicted as isolated, remote, and vulnerable, yet seem to be under constant surveillance, visualized and visited by the U.S. military, the filmmaker, and the tourist. Building upon the work of Richard Grove, Godfrey Baldacchino, and Ilan Kilman, I've turned to Caribbean and Pacific Island cultural texts to destabilize the myth of island isolation, trying to build a new critical vocabulary for theorizing relationship between land and sea, and problematizing the terms associated with island space, like isolation, vulnerability, remoteness, primitivism, and nature. In my earlier work, I turned to the Barbadian poet and historian Kamal Brathwaite's theory of tidalectics, which develops a model of thinking of islands and their relationship to the history of transoceanic migration and arrival. Foregrounding the sea is vital to theorizing the history of island space and destabilizing its assumptions of isolation. Theorizing the ocean in relationship to the land, I've argued, is integral for understanding for the complexity of island histories. Today, I want to foreground the ways in which sea level rise has created a new oceanic imaginary for island spaces and for the planetary future. So this is part one, Oceanic Imaginaries. While we might be in an era of what some have called the geo-humanities, I want to bring this in relationship to the work of scholars of the sea, theorizing oceanic histories and imaginaries, an aquavision of our terraqueous globe, which has developed in recent decades. So in my earlier work, I've argued that the humanities has taken an oceanic turn, which can be tied to the general trend to complicate the limits of the nation-state through recourse to the complex trajectories of migration, diaspora, and the global flows of empire, capital, and culture. In examining the UN Convention of the Law on the Sea, cultural histories of the ocean, and the more recent patenting of sea life, I've argued that there are major geopolitical, environmental, and even biopolitical reasons for this oceanic turn. But I think we're on the cusp of an entirely new development in this oceanic imaginary, in work that is specifically responding to the threat of sea level rising, adding a new dimension to how we might theorize our relationship to the largest space on Earth, which until recently for most was imagined as always external, which is to say the ocean is always outside until it floods your home. So there are geophysical as well as cultural implications for this turn. With the glacial melt and oceanic thermal expansion, our planetary future is becoming more oceanic. Biogeochemists have pointed out that understanding the properties of water is central to understanding the concept of climate itself, as water transforms from ice to sea to atmosphere. With the rediscovery of other major geological forces in the 1960s, like plate tectonics, a theory evidenced by studies of the deep sea, we might say that this emphasis on geomorphism and fluidity is radically destabilizing for discourses of embeddedness. 630 million people live within 30 feet of the ocean. The current projections for sea level rising are a significant threat to the 10% of the world's population that lives at 10 meters or below, as well as 13% of the world's urban population. Sea level rise may be one of our greatest visible signs of planetary change, connecting the activity of the Earth's poles with the rest of the terrestrial world, producing a new sense of planetary scale and perhaps even interconnectedness through the rising of a world ocean. Go to, yes, this one. So in some recent American productions, the ocean becomes a figure for apocalypse and terror. This is the latest book coming out on sea level rise, The Attacking Ocean. And of course, this 2012, also creating the ocean as a space of apocalypse and terror, destabilizing social, cultural, and national systems. So 20 years ago, Appelhof published his influential essay, Our Sea of Islands, arguing that the legacies of colonial belittlement that render the Pacific as islands in a far sea need to be reinvigorated by a more accurate and world-enlarging view. Instead of narratives of small, vulnerable, and peripheral places, he argued, we must recognize the primacy of the largest ocean on the planet, which facilitated both the legacies of transoceanic voyaging as well as contemporary circuits of globalization, rendering the region as a sea of islands better known as Oceania. Pacific Island Studies, which is closely linked to indigenous discourses of embeddedness in the land, has been extensively engaged with the depictions of the ocean as a space of origins and also of the future. This image here of the voyaging canoe Hokulea suggests the ways in which the regeneration of traditions can be used to benefit new connections between the islands and to aid both science and a pedagogy of climate change, as NASA and other organizations supported by the Hokulea's voyages around the Pacific to raise environmental consciousness. Ala Moana, the way of the ocean, refers in many Polynesian cultures to the oceanic past in which indigenous voyagers settled the Pacific, as well as the future in which one's departing spirit joins the ocean roads towards Hawaii, a homeland located outside of terrestrial models of space and time. Hau'ofa has famously inscribed the voyaging traditions of the region as producing a shared sense of origins and one of regional destiny in the wake of migration and globalization. As such, the ocean has functioned in cosmological, historical, and evolutionary terms as a place of origins, and more recently as a human, if not planetary, future. While Hau'ofa was a visionary, he could not have foreseen the ways in which climate change, particularly sea level rising, has transformed the islands that are in fact threatened by the expansion of the sea, faced with a new era of what has been increasingly termed carbon colonialism. Thus, in the words of the senator of the Marshall Islands, Tony DeBruym, quote, "The same ocean that has nurtured Micronesia for centuries has now become the very instrument of our destruction," end quote. A new vocabulary is developing in Oceania in which the words for climate change, which did not exist in indigenous languages, are being formed. New pedagogies, programs, and knowledges are being developed to communicate across a broad spectrum of those affected using an archipelagic framework in which information is circulating between urban island centers to the more rural satellite atolls. The ocean has been invoked as a way to unite Pacific Islanders in terms of cultural history, turning to the ancient histories of transoceanic voyaging that connect the regions, and more recently, the ocean has been perceived as a shared vulnerability, evident in the 2009 Moana, or Ocean Declaration, an initiative from Pacific church leaders to promote environmental justice in the region in response to how sea level rising is threatening food and water sovereignty as well as human rights. Since the low-lying atolls of the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tokelau, and Tuvalu are the first to feel the impact as the waters begin to rise, new maps of the Pacific are being drawn in which the smallest atolls are now attracting global attention. So in the past 6 months, I've been sitting in on multiple conferences about climate change, one at the University of Hawaii, another at the University of South Pacific, and then others on the Anthropocene, recently at University of Chicago. The conversations could not be more diverse and I suspect mutually unintelligible. But this is fitting because such complex systems of scales requires that we speak at multiple narrative registers depending on our audiences, and we can't expect that all of our narratives need to be intelligible across all scales and conversations. But today I want to sketch out some general observations about how climate change in the Pacific has been visually represented, particularly in a few texts and performances that have been produced and circulated by continentals, which is to say non-islanders, in spaces like Australia and North America. So part 2, visualizing climate change. One of the contradictions pointed out by scholars of climate change is that the science, which measures the deep time of the Earth's systems and makes projections far into the future, is not commensurate with the everyday experience of human communities and their observations of weather. This creates a bifurcation between the experience of place and time. Thus, climate facts arise from impersonal observation, whereas meanings emerge from embedded experience. This is drawn from Sheila Jasanoff's work. Moreover, climate, she says, is spatially unbounded. It is everywhere and nowhere, hence not easily accessible to imaginations rooted in specific places. So in order to cognitively bring the scales of climate and weather together, the visualization of climate change, which may produce both evidence and empathy, becomes crucial. Therefore, the distribution of visual images of stranded polar bears on ice floes or Pacific Islanders wading through flooded villages creates a new oceanic imaginary. It becomes a means by which many are able to recognize, empathize, and perhaps even become inspired to mitigate climate change. It is on this basis of visualizing climate change and bringing those who are the most impacted by sea level rise to the largest greenhouse gas emitters, aka the US, that inspired the 2010 Water is Rising performance event. There you go. So here's from their, this is image from their website. This is an enormous undertaking by one of my UCLA colleagues to employ the arts in the service of raising awareness of the ongoing U.S. dispossession of the atmosphere. That's another image. My colleague raised funds to support the recruitment of dancers from the Pacific Island nations Kiribati, Tokelau, and Tuvalu to share both their traditional and new dance forms they had developed to raise consciousness of the ways in which the salinization of their taro beds, flooding of their schools and homes, and loss of their ancestral burial grounds were making atoll life untenable. In an era of American-style climate change denial, the Islanders of the Water is Rising event became the visible evidence of the reality of sea level rise and global warming. Global warming is a long cumulative effect of industrial capitalism, what Rob Nixon would call slow violence, which exceeds the narrative boundaries of the temporal pace of modernity. Thus, these islanders, like those that figure in the climate change films examined by Carol Forbarco, become the embodied figures for the articulated stress of climate change, that's borrowing from Forbarco, as well as, quote, ventriloquists for a Western crisis of nature, end quote. So, in keeping with a part-for-whole relationship that figures a small tropical island as the world, the atoll signifies enormous scalar density. and spatial collapse in the sense that the atoll is the world and the world is the atoll, as well as temporal elongation, which is the pre-modern past or the pre-capitalist past, and then our global warming future. So this is in keeping with environmental discourse in which the future and the past are presented as imminent in the present. Thus, in Water is Rising and the documentaries I'll discuss, the tropical islander figures as the human past, depicted in a close relationship to non-human nature, especially the sea, as well as a symbol for the planetary future, in that these atolls are canaries in the coal mine, as they're repeatedly called, of atmospheric pollution. So I first met the Water is Rising dance troupe at a round table at UCLA, their first stop on a tour that would take them to universities across the country, as well as to Rockefeller performance spaces like the Rockefeller Center in New York. As I crossed the quad to the building in which we were to host a roundtable on climate change, I could see the dance troupe sitting in a large circle in the grass outside the building, dressed in t-shirts, lava-lavas, jeans, and flip-flops, playing guitars and singing Bob Marley songs. When the preview to the performance began an hour later, they performed in the traditional style of their homes and languages without English translation, and were introduced as traveling from some of the most remote and isolated islands of the Pacific. The dances, which represent complex knowledge systems in the Pacific, were presented as entertainment. The juxtaposition of reggae-singing youth to the performance of an isolated indigeneity was striking and something I had already encountered in the UCLA marketing of the event. So let me juxtapose two images here of Michaela Maeva, the artistic director of the troupe from Tokelau. Here's a picture and self-description he provided for the Water is Rising site. It's on their website, in which we can see he studied overseas, worked for nearly a decade for the UN, and has been active in various international indigenous fora on the environment and climate change. Here's the UCLA Today campus newspaper, how he was depicted, in which his ample bio note, which you just saw, is reduced to he becomes a native of Tokelau. And actually the first UCLA version of this only said a native of the Pacific until I complained to the editor. So this got me thinking about how North American audiences were receiving Pacific Islanders as the harbingers of climate change, rendered as figures of an isolated, natural, and nature-loving culture that were being appropriated to critique the petrocapitalism of the West. I turned to the remarkable output of documentaries on the topic that focus on the atolls of the Pacific. So this includes, I think it begins with the 2000 film Rising Waters, Global Warming and the Fate of the Pacific Islands. Next there's Paradise Drowned, Tuvalu, the Disappearing Nation, which features the caption you can see at the top, See the World's Most Endangered Country. And you'll notice as I go through this similarities in all the title covers, which all feature the ocean in some way. In 2004, in 2005, you have The Disappearing of Tuvalu, Trouble in Paradise, and Time and Tide, followed by There Was Once an Island in 2010, and The Hungry Tide about Kiribati in 2011. So this particular genre begins to solidify over the years, and while there is some diversity in the one or two films that mention colonial history or nuclear testing, or show testimonies and struggles at the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Summit, generally speaking, these documentaries tell the story in predictable ways. The films focus almost exclusively on village life, feature ample images of the ocean, islanders fishing, children running on the beach, sunsets, palm trees, the camera person at work in the islands, images of flooded homes, and interviews with subjects who are considering migrating to metropolitan centers like Australia and New Zealand. Atoll life is quite beautifully imagined in the romantic light of a setting sun over the ocean, reflecting what the film suggests is a dying culture. The dying culture is at once the death of an untouched pastoral past, right, which is to say a Celsius idol, as well as the planet's future. The key words of the films, evidenced by their titles, are disappearance, paradise drowned, trouble in paradise, and endangerment, remarkably like the kind of extinction narratives that you see documenting the loss of non-human species. This positions a filmmaker in a long history of what's called salvage anthropology, which is to say a kind of mourning that we might liken to imperious nostalgia, to borrow from Renato Rosaldo. This nostalgia is particular to Salce's discourse, which is an aestheticization of an island lifestyle imagined outside modernity and labor, which is just to say you pluck everything from the trees and you don't have to work for anything, which is obviously a myth. So this is evident in the following promotional material on the Time and Tide website. Quote, "The heart-wrenching and beautiful film Time and Tide is like one of Gauguin's rare found object sculptures, simultaneously celebrating a precious, Edenic time and place while calling attention to the fact that it is perhaps lost forever." Quote. So let me play the trailer of the film just to give you a little sense of what these films are like. This one is called King Tide, The Sinking of Tuvalu. This is done by a Dutch director, Jurjen
Unless
Booj.
urgent actions are done against climate change, in 50 years' time, the world will just come and collect our bodies in the sea.
Tuvalu is one of the smallest and most remote countries on Earth, with a total landmass comprising only 26 square kilometers, scattered over 900,000 square kilometers of the Pacific Ocean. The country is in danger of disappearing beneath the waves due to the effect of global warming. Not an Atlantis myth, but the reality of this century. The highest point of Tuvalu is only 4.5 meters above sea level. The average elevation is not even 2.
We see this inland flooding more frequent.
Yes, we will certainly move because if the tide rises, where could we go?
If you have the sea water coming very often over the ground, makes the surface of those grounds very infertile.
The first thing they're going to feel is increased severity of severe storms. So you build up your natural defences, so that's protecting your coral reefs.
Maybe you enter my house tomorrow. See.
Like the Papa said, when God promised to Noah, this is the rainbow, this is the sign that there will be no more flood.
I don't know if you could hear that last bit, but there was an invocation of that God said that when the rainbow comes, that to Noah that the flooding is over. So here, an English-speaking Western narrator depicts the nation of Tuvalu as small, remote, endangered, and sinking, and covers all the basic aesthetic and informational ground of these climate nostalgia films. The sea, fishing communities, children in the water, village life and flooding, testimony of increasing tides, evidence of garden flooding, traditional dance, migration narratives, a white scientist, and a Tuvaluan testifying that they can trust in God because he already told Noah earthly flooding is over. The only thing missing from this particular clip is island music, which usually is the major theme, and a sunset. So these documentaries trade in what Susan Sontag referred to as the imagination of disaster, but they differ in their engagement with modernity. In her critique of science fiction films, Sontag was focused on what she called a, quote, dispassionate aesthetic view of destruction and violence, a technological view that we might see in films like 2012. In contrast, these climate change nostalgia films specifically bracket out modernity and technology from atoll life, depicting slow violence and a narrative of mourning about the loss of a subsistence mode of living in which the Western viewer is only distantly implicated. Rosaldo defines imperialist nostalgia as, quote, when agents of colonialism long for the very forms of life they intentionally altered or destroyed, end quote. So I want to quote, he published this quite a long time ago, but I think it's returning. So let me quote from him at length, because I think it's worth thinking about in terms of the history of empire as well as how imperialist narrative forms are rekindled in a new era of carbon colonialism. So quoting from Rosaldo, imperialist nostalgia revolves around a paradox. A person kills somebody and then mourns the victim. In a more attenuated form, someone deliberately alters a form of life and then regrets that things have not remained as they were prior to the intervention. At one more remove, people destroy their environment and then they worship nature. In any of its versions, imperialist nostalgia uses a pose of innocent yearning, both to capture people's imaginations and to conceal its complicity with often brutal domination. We, who believe in progress, he says, valorize innovation and then yearn for more stable worlds, whether these reside in our own past, in other cultures, or in the conflation of the two, end quote. So in his work on elegy, Timothy Morton argues that in Western aesthetic forms, nature figures as a scenery or a backdrop, quote, what he says, an analog for what has been lost, which is to say the human, right? It figures as a metaphor for the human. But when the poet turns to ecology, this sounding board becomes the object of lamentation, right? So nature then becomes the object. As a result, the poet, or maybe the reader, slips from mourning, which is a way of locating the lost object, into melancholia, which is when the lost object then becomes the environment, without a method of redressing loss. Writing about climate change, Morton notes, ecological elegy weeps for that which will have passed, right? It's a kind of future mourning, given a continuation of current state of affairs. In contrast, these nostalgia films weep for a loss of culture that figures as a loss of the environment. These films complicate Morton's argument. They're able to circumvent the issue of the lost object by using Pacific Islanders as the figures for nature, a well-worn colonial trope. Therefore, the continental viewer mourns the loss of atoll culture and life worlds as an analog for a destruction of a global environment in ways that often suppress the viewer's complicity. So Hofe has encouraged us to examine the oceanic contours of a sea of islands, and the impacts of climate change have ensured that this is so. But this oceanic imaginary sea level rising, at least for most of these films, has fallen into the well-worn tread of Tris Tropique. Risaldo reminds us that salvage work is meant to record a culture before it disappears in the wake of modernity. And in this case, modernity is paradoxically nature and anthropogenic climate change. The salvage narrative once helped authorize funding for one generation of anthropologists in the Pacific under British, French, and American state empires, and is now catalyzing a new generation of journalists, filmmakers, and scholars who descend on Kiribati, Tokelau, and Tuvalu to interview residents about nothing but climate change. So salvage work also has the possibility to criticize destructive intrusions of imperialism and regimes, and to be used to critique the imperial center, as Risaldo points out. So rather than dismissing these films altogether, which is tempting, I want to suggest that this form of oceanic imaginary is misrepresentative as it may be of the islands and the peoples themselves, may utilize an effective narrative strategy for those people, to quote from Michel Serres, quote, who are indifferent to climate except during vacations when they rediscover the world in a clumsy Arcadian way. These, end quote, these films of climate change nostalgia arising from and produced by carbon colonialism reflect a new idiom that are largely appealing to those, and again, to quote from Serres, who, quote, pollute what they don't know, which rarely hurts them and never concerns them, end quote. To that end, the few of the films that juxtapose atoll life with the ways in which community leaders are fighting for environmental justice and for the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, rather than simply adapting, which is most of the narrative of most of these films, provide clearer ways for the audience to position the islands in the present, rather than always distant in an irrecoverable pastoral past. So part 3, tell them, weaving the strands of obligation. So perhaps not surprisingly, climate change is not the major subject of Pacific Island literary, cultural, or even visual production. When it is addressed, it is largely through the initiative of development and arts grants that originate from the larger carbon emitters, like the US and Australia. However, there's one poem I want to conclude with because it offers a far more complex narrative form that does not idealize a South Seas pastoral and suggests the webs of obligation that connect us across the seas. The root of obligation, Michel Serres writes, is ligar, to bond, to tie, and to weave. I conclude my paper with a different visual and oral aesthetic of Sea Level Rise by the Marshallese poet Kathy Jetnil-Kishner. This performance, recorded at the 2012 Olympics Poetry Parnassus, does not employ an aerial kind of God's eye view of the tropical atoll as we see over and over in these films, but rather places the poet high above the audience with the cold, stormy skies of London swirling behind her. Her poem invokes some of the same imaginary that we've seen in the documentaries: fine white sand, sweet harmonies of songs, papaya golden sunsets, but she immediately juxtaposes what might initially be considered idyllic with everyday modernities, like an island clogged with chugging cars and styrofoam cups of Kool-Aid. Jetnil-Kishner's emphasis here in foregrounding a narrative of a gifted basket is about weaving together connections and obligations across the Pacific. These bonds are legally established with the Compact of Free Association Micronesian states have with the U.S., which grew out of the 1946 American annexation of Micronesia in order to develop a base for its military and to conduct 3 decades of nuclear testing, which poisoned and displaced thousands of Marshallese. In a shift from irradiation to sea level rise, this colonial relationship between the U.S. and the Marshalls is producing new ecological effects. In speaking about the imminent threat of losing their islands to the sea and receiving no cooperation from the U.S., Tony DeBroom noted at a recent climate change conference that, quote, "the people of the Marshall Islands are not unfamiliar with the narrative that they need to move in order to guarantee others peace and security," end quote. So in the poem I'll show, Jetnil-Kishner offers her American friends a gift: handcrafted jewels from the sea, black pearls and cowrie shell earrings placed in hand-woven baskets, products of women's love and labor. Inside the basket is a message for the reader or the viewer to pass on. You tell them, she implores, where these gifts came from, the Marshall Islands, and ask the reader to show them where it is on a map. Deeply influenced by Hawufa's work on Pacific voyaging cultures and networks of trade and kinship, she declares in this poem, quote, "we are the ocean," which is also the title of Hawufa's essay collection. She fashions her poetry as a basket, which is in turn is a metaphor for the island, emphasizing the ways in which the earrings and the basket she has made for her audience travel. Like her words, the poet creates new webs of obligation in an alternative vision of sea level rising. So I'm going to leave her to conclude.
I prepared the package for my friends in the States. The dangling earrings woven into half moons, black pearls glinting like an eye in a storm of tight spirals. The baskets, sturdy, also woven, brown cowrie shell shiny, intricate mandalas shaped by calloused fingers. Inside the basket, I write a message. Wear these earrings to parties, to classes and meetings, to the corner store, the grocery store, and while riding the bus. Store jewelry, incense, copper coins, and curling letters like this one in this basket. And when others ask you where you got this, you tell them they're from the Marshall Islands. Show them where it is on a map. Tell them we are a proud people toasted dark brown as the carved ribs of a tree stump. Tell them we are descendants of the finest navigators in the world. Tell them our islands were dropped from a basket carried by a giant. Tell them we are the hollow hulls of canoes as fast as the wind slicing through the Pacific Sea. We are wood shavings and drying pandanus leaves and siquipiros at kemems. Tell them we are the sweet harmonies of mothers, aunties, sisters, songs late into night. Tell them we are whispered prayers, the breath of God, a crown of fuchsia flowers encircling Auntie Mary's white seafoam hair. Tell them we are styrofoam cups of Kool-Aid red, waiting patiently for the Ilomid. We are papaya golden sunsets bleeding into a glittering open sea. We are skies uncluttered, majestic and sweeping in their landscape. We are the ocean, terrifying and regal in its power. Tell them we are dusty rubber slippers swiped from concrete doorsteps. We are the ripped seams and the broken door handles of taxis. We are sweaty hands shaking another sweaty hand in heat. Tell them we are days and nights hotter than anything you can imagine. Tell them we are little girls with braids, cartwheeling beneath the rain. We are shards of broken beer bottles burrowed beneath fine, white sand. We are children, flinging like rubber bands across a road clogged with chugging cars. Tell them we only have one road. And after all this, tell them about the water, how we have seen it rising, flooding across our cemeteries, gushing over our seawalls, and crashing against our homes. Tell them what it's like to see the entire ocean level with the land. Tell them we are afraid. Tell them we don't know of the politics or the science, but we see what is in our own backyard. Tell them some of us are old fishermen who believe that God made us a promise. Tell them some of us are a little bit more skeptical of God. But most importantly, tell them we don't want to leave. We've never wanted to leave. And that we are nothing without our islands.
Thank you, Liz. Our first discussant, do you want to come up one at a time? Is that the way you want to do this? Is that all right? Okay. Our first discussant is Karla Mallette. She's professor of Italian here at the University of Michigan.
You can leave the lights down actually, because I have a PowerPoint. Thank you.
Where is it?
It should be on the desktop. Close.
Close.
Ban. Yeah, that's it. Okay. So thank you so much for that talk. I am everything I know about the South Pacific I learned this afternoon. And because I wasn't able to review a lot of the images that we saw this afternoon while I was preparing my comments, really what I conceived for today was sort of, postcards from my thalassology to yours, responses to some of the topics that I knew you were going to address, but coming very much from my own perspective and from my own point of view. And in response to this wonderful material that you've presented to us today. And what I'm going to present is going to be much less dramatic and gorgeous than those images that we just saw, I must say. Really, the poetic performance, I tried to imagine it reading through the paper that I saw, and really did not come up with anything nearly as wonderful as what we just saw. My first comments really are addressed not just to Liz's paper, but to the day, to what we've been thinking about together all day long. And that is the meaning of this word insular, isolation, words that have been at the center of some of the conversations that we've been having today. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, this word signifies, first, pertaining to islanders, especially having the characteristic traits of the inhabitants of an island, for instance, of Great Britain. I want to pause for a moment to let you sort of soak in, to let this weirdness soak in, why the OED feels the need to introduce that self-reflective element in order to define the word island for us. I really can't reconstruct. The definition takes a curious turn in the next clause. It becomes much less scientific. It acquires much more of a distinct ethical connotation, cut off from intercourse with other nations, isolated, self-contained, narrow or prejudiced in feelings, ideas, or manners. So the word in modern usage connotes willful singularity, resistance to alterity, resistance to difference, and it regularly carries this political resonance that's alluded to in the OED definition, cut off from intercourse with other nations. People may isolate themselves, but so too may nations, and an insular nation bodes ill to itself and to those foreign powers that it ignores or even directly resists. The related adjective isolated has some similar connotations, but like the noun insular, it didn't acquire those connotations until relatively recently in the history of the language, until the late 18th century, the early 19th century. So, according to evidence that we heard this morning, around the same time of the emergence of the word coast, right, as noun. The adjective isolated is a borrowing from the French isolé, which itself was a borrowing from the Italian isolato. The OED entry on isolated, as you see, begins by citing English authors who are using the French isolé, not the English cognate, although that had already been formed by this time. As the usage examples in the OED attest, English authors continued to use the French word, the French original, for some time, even after the English language had created its own cognate. So the English isolated, which was formed like the Italian isolato on a Latinate verb model. This was first attested in 1763, so it was there in the late 18th century. But as late as 1791, more than 25 years later, Boswell quotes Johnson as saying, "This Hanoverian family is isolé here. They have no friends." The English language ultimately would accept the English cognate, the English invention, but it would not go down without a fight. I direct your attention to the early attestation of the English, from the cognate adjective, the English version, from the work published in 1800. So it's the last one on the screen here. The affected, Frenchified, and unnecessary word isolated is not English, and we trust it never will be. This definition is delicious, of course, because the sentence is delicious because it expresses the very quality to which the word refers, right? And it illustrates its xenophobic nuances in the process. It may seem odd to describe an 1800 use of this word isolated as early. Clearly, this word, like insular, derives from a Latinate root, but early appearances of this cluster of words, insular, isolated, the verb to isolate, they don't carry these sort of negative connotations that we're seeing in later usage. So, for instance, the noun insular, meaning of or pertaining to an island, as, for instance, insular vegetation. You see that as early as 1611. But the earliest appearance of the word with this expanded semantic range, which means, cut off, self-contained, narrow, prejudice, this dates only to 1775. So, more than a year after this word had been in circulation. That's how long a century. That's how long it took for the word to begin to mean kind of closed off from communication with the outside world, and the word did not become common in this usage until after the beginning of the 19th century. And you see a similar pattern in the Romance languages. The insularity begins to acquire these negative connotations, and the political dimension of that negativity in particular comes to the forefront, begins to be prominent around the midpoint of the 18th century, and really only begins to be sort of the go-to meaning for the word in the middle of the 19th century. The history of Great Britain, an island itself, as the OED likes to remind us, had, I think, a significant impact on the evolution of the word. Napoleon's continental system, instituted in 1806 and intended precisely to isolate Great Britain, and to consolidate the power of the European states, furnishes a significant point of reference for this lexical history. In retaliation for this policy, Britain, in order to secure a trade route to the colonies, Egypt, and in particular India, which was accessed after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 by means of the Mediterranean shipping lanes, Britain would occupy first Gibraltar, then Sicily, then Malta, in order to... Yeah, exactly. During the centuries of modernity, the Mediterranean islands were significant primarily as means for Northern European empires to consolidate and administer their colonial holdings. This, of course, is not, I'm primarily a historian of the Middle Ages. This is very different from medieval Mediterranean history. Indeed, these connotations of cultural isolation that are born by the word insular have little relevance to the Mediterranean islands during the Middle Ages. On the contrary, before the 19th century, the affliction of the Mediterranean islands tended to be precisely the opposite, and that is an inability to protect themselves from a too promiscuous connectivity. The Mediterranean islands functioned as way stations for merchants and armies. The competing cultural traditions of the medieval world washed their shores. In an era before policies of cultural protectionism, they had little capacity precisely to isolate themselves, to insulate themselves from cultural influence, and especially from cultural conquest. Porfirio Diaz once wrote in an epigraph that has since become famous, much cited, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." One can imagine a similar lament for Sicily, Malta, Cyprus, Majorca, Corsica, Sardinia during an earlier era, so far from God and so close to pretty much everybody else. Of course, this intense cultural connectivity experienced by the Mediterranean islands might at times be perceived as a blessing, at least by historians, as it made those islands so interesting, right? The depositories of the cultural riches of the Middle Ages. We've heard in Liz's paper about a life made untenable by carbon colonialism. In the pre-modern Mediterranean, populations were much more often threatened and displaced by unhyphenated colonialism. Colonialism, plain and simple. And these displacements and ruptures interrupted lives and created misery. At the same time, they generated some of the most memorable and most treasured cultural monuments of medieval Mediterranean culture. And I'd like to just briefly quote Arab Sicilian poet Ibn Hamdis, who left Sicily after the Norman invasion toward the end of the 11th century. This is my translation. In the original, each line ends with a feminine possessive pronoun. And in these closing lines of the poem, that pronoun most always refers to Sicily. So you have to imagine this knell at the end of each line that calls us back to Sicily and calls Sicily back to our minds. I remember Sicily, he says, and my grief is awakened by remembering her. The abode of youthful pleasures stands empty, and its residents were a people of elegance. But if I have been driven out of paradise, then let me still recount its story. If weeping were not salt water, I would think my tears were a river. At 20, I laughed with youthful pleasures. At 60, I cry for her burdens. But do not make the offenses more grievous within yourself, since your Lord does not cease to forgive them. Obviously, this is not nearly as beautiful as the poem that we just heard. Translated poetry is not nearly as beautiful as poetry in the original. But I hope that you can hear these echoes of nostalgia for what has been lost, what is at risk of loss in the poem by Kathy Jetnell-Kitchener that we just heard. And Mediterranean Studies is teaching scholars to listen more closely to voices like these, voices that come as witness to tell us about what has been lost. What I don't have time to read you today is the heart of this poem, which describes a night of carousing at a convent in Sicily. Where the nuns make a cottage industry out of selling wine to the local Muslim youth. And Ibn Hamdis describes this night of epic revelry where the nuns lock the doors at nightfall and cup after cup of wine is downed. And the nuns, who turn out, of course, to be as beautiful as gazelles beneath the habits, dance and sing for their guests by the end of the night. So Liz did a good job of making us feel what is at risk of loss in the Southern Pacific. And this is a dynamic that is not entirely lost on us in southeastern Michigan. And I wanted to close by sort of thinking through some of the sorts of images and the topics that were just presented to us and thinking about them in very local terms. Here, the problem is not precisely colonialism, but rather economic disparity, which sets in motion a series of revalorizations and displacements of capital and of populations. Rather than imperialist nostalgia or salvage work, the aestheticization of this phenomenon by those who come outside tends to be called ruin porn by locals. I'm talking about Detroit, of course, our local catastrophe, which is treated, especially by European observers who are peculiarly drawn to it, as a window into a structural weakness at the heart of America, and as a reminder also of the terrible power of time and the ephemeral beauty of life. In other words, this is an expression of the sublime. It's intimately connected in spirit to the European pictorial tradition of representation of ruins. Typically, in the European context, this is ancient grandeur gone to seed in the capital cities of the Mediterranean. And it's viewed with a mixture of horror and titillation by its audience, who are meant to feel that our own fate is reflected in the catastrophes that we see here, and our own destruction at the hands of forces infinitely greater than we are. But maybe that makes these photographs sound a bit more interesting than they really are. In this photographic genre, the truly interesting ethical argument is evaded. These spaces are carefully emptied of any human presence. They're vacant. The interesting questions are addressed, I think, when agency is acknowledged and aesthetics and ethics are in communication. Whose city is this? How are these spaces lived? No man is an island, and I'm the first person here today to quote John Donne. No woman is an island. No city is an island. As it turns out, as the history of the word insular teaches us, no island is an island. Putting insular voices into conversation with continentals seems to me to be the way to bring ethics and aesthetics together and to pay meaningful witness to some of the challenges that face vulnerable sites, isolated by ecological and economic circumstance. Thank you. Yeah, that's for you.
Yep, thanks. Terrific. Thanks, Karla. Our second discussant is Jamie Jones. She's a research fellow with the English Language and Literature, of English Language and Literature. So, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Let me get my PowerPoint set up here. All right. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. I'm itching to talk more about Detroit, to continue that conversation, but I'll bring us back to the islands, bring us back to the sea, us inland souls going out to sea, as Emily Dickinson put it. Thanks so much to the International Institute, to Ken for inviting me, and to Liz and Karla for staging a really wonderful conversation. So, I'll continue in the tradition of sending postcards from my field of studies to yours, to ours. So in charting the prospect for oceanic studies in PMLA a few years ago, literary critic Hester Blum at Penn State implored us to remember the sea is not a metaphor. She advocates for a praxis of oceanic studies that is attentive to the material conditions and praxis of the maritime world, one that draws from the epistemological structures provided by the lives and writings of those for whom the sea was simultaneously workplace, home, passage, penitentiary, and promise. Those are Blum's words about how to understand the materiality of the sea. My own work in oceanic studies follows in this line. I researched the U.S. whaling industry of the 19th century, examining how the industry was represented in literary, visual, and material culture. I chronicle cultural artifacts produced by sailors who went whaling, attending to the material conditions and praxis of whalers' maritime and intellectual labor. In my work, I also examined whaling texts and objects that circulated far beyond the coastal communities of dispatched voyages. You don't have to live on the coast or work on the sea to believe that the ocean is real, significant, fascinating, even in mid-19th century America, which is the sort of moment in which I'm at home. Like the atolls of the Pacific, remote yet under surveillance, the ocean to an inlander was also remote yet visible. To understand the politics and aesthetics of those representations of the sea as it appeared to inlanders, it's necessary to revisit the old myths and metaphors, the immaterial ocean that we see in these pictures. There were and are for those for whom the sea is not an environment of lived experience, of embedded experience, but in fact, an imagined environment. In reflecting on how sea level rise has created a new oceanic imaginary, Liz reminds us of the terrible power of myth. Immaterial oceans and oceanic narratives can wreak material havoc, do real harm. Liz told us that the myth of the island isolate underwrote the militarization and irradiation of the Pacific. And she has offered us the contours of a new oceanic imaginary, an oceanic iteration of the vanishing Indian myth for the age of carbon colonialism. Liz offers us her observations on how climate change in the Pacific has been represented by continentals, these films that show us a palmy, beachy idyll of island life endangered, like a panda, by the rising sea. These texts wildly misrepresent islanders, but she suggests that these visualizations might, in her words, produce evidence and empathy that will bring the problem of sea level rise to continentals, for whom climate change is not part of lived experience. I was struck in hearing Liz's work by her characterization of the sea itself in this new oceanic imaginary. She told us, and I quote you, "The ocean, which has long figured in the Pacific Islands as a means of subsistence, origins, cosmology, and regional connection, now becomes a figure for destructive change." In order to understand just how far this oceanic imaginary in the age of sea level rise has changed and is new, I'd like to return for a moment to the 19th century and to the complex and often paradoxical oceanic myths produced by cultural texts about the sea in that period. The world's oceans, from the point of view of merchant traders and imperial navies, was a space for transportation between imperial metropole and resource-rich colony, a two-dimensional obstacle to be managed through navigational technology, cartography, and ship design. This is especially the case for texts. I say this gently, hesitatingly, tentatively. This is especially the case for texts produced about the Atlantic Ocean, perhaps, where merchant and navy ships traveled direct from continent to continent or from Europe to the Caribbean islands. In written accounts of colonial exchange and of overseas trade and exchange, the sea, at its most well-behaved best, is an undifferentiated space, the blank space on the maps. In our Sea of Islands, Hau'ofa also describes the effacement of the ocean in the age of 19th century colonial expansion. He writes, 19th century, and this is to quote Hau'ofa, 19th century imperialism erected boundaries that led to the contraction of Oceania, transforming a once boundless world into the Pacific Island states and territories that we know today. This is the historical basis of the view that our countries are small, poor, and isolated. It is true only insofar as people are still fenced in and quarantined. Paradoxically, the 19th century oceanic world seemed to have been a terrestrial world, a world of large and small terrestrial entities in contact with each other across a vast waste. The result for islands and islanders was the belittling of a world which, according to the islanders themselves, had been vast, enlarged, encompassing the sea itself along with a rich web of inter-island exchange. The result for the ocean was that it was effaced, made into the blank space it's so often represented on maps. In its early years as a field of academic inquiry, Atlantic studies enforced the terrestrial bias of the 19th century imperial world, and the field reproduced the trope of the empty ocean as well. A few years ago, Jeff Bolster, who's come up today already, argued for putting the Atlantic back in Atlantic history, and he, among others, have worked to do so by attending to the sea as a space of habitation, albeit temporary, for shipboard sailors, for those who travel the sea in the form of a penitentiary ship, and for marine life, non-living beings, and geophysical phenomena in the non-human ocean. Bolster's contribution is, of course, the Mortal Sea, which chronicles the depletion of cod and menhaden. So back in the 19th century, the paradoxical myth of the empty ocean fed and was fed by the romantic tropes of the ocean as, quote, the trackless sea or the trackless waste, phrases that were passed around like playing cards among Shelley, Byron, Keats, and their legions of readers and imitators. Trackless is a fascinating way of describing the ocean and produces the myth of the ocean as immutable, a hard, obdurate surface invulnerable to human presence. And this particular iteration of the myth of the immutable sea, as I'm calling it, really also misrepresents the geophysical facts of the ocean. Satellite pictures, a lot of which are circulating now, very interestingly, show us that a ship's wake does leave a track on both the surface of the sea and in the clouds above that endures visibly on the surface of the ocean for long after a ship has passed. So the ocean actually does wear on its physical face the trace of human presence, oceanic exchange, giving the fiction to this old trope of the trackless sea. So just as the myth of the island isolate underwrote the militarization and nuclear irradiation of the Pacific, the myth of the immutable sea underwrote our various centuries-long projects of filling the sea with our garbage and emptying the sea of its fish, the two faces of anthropogenic damage to the oceans. And I felt I had to mention sea trash since it's been literally looming above our heads today in the stunning promotional poster for today's Islands Symposium. In an essay on sea trash, dark pools, and the tragedy of the commons, our colleague here at Michigan, Patsy Yeager, describes the environmental damage wrought by the myth of the immutable sea. She writes, "The sea functions in literature and culture as a trope instead of a biotic world or swarm of agencies. But even shadowy or unnatural tropes have real-world consequences. Figures of the boundless sea or the oceanic sublime encourage humans to treat it as an inexhaustible storehouse of goods." Yeager names the presence of ocean trash as a signal that we must revise our understanding of the techno-ocean, to acknowledge, again as she writes, that late capitalist seas are becoming more techno than ocean. Sea level rise, too, alters this myth, forces us to see the sea as immutable in its most basic physical fact, its enormity. Something that drives my interest in the 19th century whaling industry is that its cultural productions, to some degree, disrupt or complicate the myths of the empty sea. The whaling industry supplied the nation with whale oil, the energy source that lit lamps and lubricated machinery in the rapidly industrializing US and around the world. I have not yet found any credible evidence that ordinary whalemen or their underwriters understood that they were overfishing whales. Serial depletion did drive East Coast whale fishermen from the Atlantic to the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Over the course of the 19th century, voyages grew longer and ships grew larger to accommodate the fact that whales were just harder and harder to find. We know this as the phenomenon of serial depletion. But 19th century sources seem to indicate that whale fishermen understood the increasing scarcity of whales as evidence of learned behavior. The whales were just getting wilier and not rarer. But whale fishermen and their underwriters could not enforce the myth of the empty sea. The sea was the site, after all, of their energy resource. One of the most interesting, I think, maps produced in the 19th century is this map of currents and whaling grounds. You'll see these cloud-like places, these fuzzy, dark, smudgy, inky blots. Those represent whaling grounds. And there's some small currents drawn in arrows as well. This map was produced by the United States Exploring Expedition of 1838 to 1842, one of America's first attempts at nationally sponsored cartography. One of the expedition's stated goals was to support the whaling industry, a major national interest. The blurry shaded areas on this map indicate fruitful whaling grounds, which shifted from year to year and even from day to day as whale populations migrated and contracted. The tentative cloud-like forms representing whaling grounds stand in contrast to the aggressive black lines marking the shorelines of continents, which, as John Gillis told us earlier today, those aggressive black lines are themselves an interesting fiction for us to discuss. The movement of American whaling ships into seas all over the world look much like other forms of imperial territorial expansion. But in this particular case, the territory consisted of the invisible and unfixed bodies of whales. This map visualizes the ocean as a space whose depths are unknown yet populous. This map destabilizes the myth of the empty ocean and showed how whaling itself resisted efforts of cartographers to quarantine oceanic space in the way that it attempted to quarantine islands. And I can't resist showing you this map. There's a striking resemblance of my whaling grounds map to this contemporary map of the gyres of oceanic trash. It's a haunting visualization of how trash has supplanted marine life and of how ocean trash itself has become a source of epistemological struggle and trouble and mystery, a new site for the oceanic sublime. So I will conclude my remarks by returning to the islands, Herman Melville, and he hasn't come up much today either. interestingly. As complicit as he was with 19th century imperial ideology and with continental bias, produced texts that also, to some degree, complicated the myths of the empty sea, the immutable sea, and the isolated or the island isolate. I'd argue that the strangeness of his view might have been a result of his direct experience with whaling, which, even as it prefigured petrocapitalism and wrought its own form of environmental destruction, never could fully endorse the myths of the empty and the immutable sea. I'd like to place on the table for our discussion two instances of Melville writing on islands so that we can reflect on his island myths alongside the others we have heard today. Melville's islands complicate the myth of the island isolate. He describes islands in contact, in federation with each other, not remote, but almost claustrophobically proximate. In the opening chapter of Moby Dick, Loomings, Ishmael offers a vision of Manhattan as an island, an interesting island in context with the others we've heard about, but one not isolated or quarantined from international exchange and commerce, not by a long shot. He writes, quote, "There now is your insular city of the Manhattoes, belted round by wharves as Indian isles by coral reefs. Commerce surrounds it with her surf." Ishmael re-indigenizes Manhattan, putting it in league with islands of the Indian Ocean, not remote but proximate through comparison. Oceanic exchange almost suffocates the island, making it not at all remote but surrounded. Commerce surrounds rather than flowing outward or inward from the insular city. And thank goodness Karla gave us that really helpful etymology of insular to understand the degrees of complexity in this passage. And later in Moby Dick, Ishmael reflects on the islanders that filled out the crews of whale ships. Pacific Islanders, Azorians, Shetland Islanders, and Ishmael himself from the island of Manhattan. How it is, there is no telling, but islanders seem to make the best whalemen. They were nearly all islanders in the Pequod. Isolatos, too, I call such, not acknowledging the common continent of men, but each isolato living on a separate continent of his own. Yet now, federated along one keel, what a set these isolatos were. Isolato comes from the Italian, but our good old strange OED sort of cites its first appearance in the English language to this passage in Melville, interestingly enough. Though Melville nearly ventriloquizes Liz's myth of the island isolate, the image of isolatos crammed together in the hull of a ship, federated along one keel, paradoxically enforces the myth of island remoteness and isolation, while at the same time demonstrating its impossibility. So thanks very much.
I'll just say thank you, both of you, for the response, particularly because I didn't give you a lot of lead time before I gave you my paper. So I really appreciate both the focus on the isolation narrative and its etymological roots, and also the oceanic, and especially Jamie in your piece thinking through. I think one of the things that's been exciting about the development in oceanic studies is that it went from a kind of surface thing, whereas in Redeker and Leinbaugh's work, where it's something for communities to cross over, to actually start thinking through the depths, right? The kind of work that Stefan Helmreich and other people are doing in terms of thinking through what's beneath the surface. In my earlier work, I had been actually looking at a rewriting of Benito Cereno and trying to think through the image of a ship caught in the doldrums, and it seems to me a way that narratively the author can actually, because you can't, even if you're a sailor, you're not occupying the sea because of currents, right? Currents are always moving. So this idea of trying to create an embedded knowledge in an oceanic point is actually almost impossible because of the mobility, right? And so what I found interesting in Melville is that he was stopping the ship in the doldrums so that all this waste accumulates around the ship. And this is then John Hearn's rewrite of it. And so, and it's a slave ship, and so there's a way that the kind of embeddedness in the ocean happens because of the failure of the ship to move, right? And so it's this idea of a kind of movement against mobility that then creates embeddedness. And it actually has narrative effects, which I won't go into. But so I appreciate the whole raising question about waste in the sea, I think, which is both an ecological as well as an important kind of political issue as well, as we think about these kind of extraterritorial spaces and who then gains, where the networks of obligation are in terms of that. Yeah. It's been a long day. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Questions?
Questions?
Well, thank you, everybody, and especially Elizabeth, for that wonderful set of presentations. Being a person of deserts, I'm, out of my depth here in so many ways. But one thing that struck me about the futurism of the films and documentaries that you adverted to, including 2012, is that my reading of the record, and I can easily be corrected by those who know more, is that since 1880, the sea levels have risen on average 7.7 inches, which for alluvial areas and riparian areas should already have been significant. That is to say, it should be possible to do a history of the impact of that kind of rise on the islands over the past 120 years already. Not just the future impact, but what has already occurred. I know that in places like Egypt and Bangladesh, which I know better, this rise has had an impact on salinization at the mouth of rivers and salinization of soil and so forth. So I just wonder if attending to the past century and a half of a history of these impacts might give a certain kind of historical depth to the consideration of the near future.
Thank you for that question. I'm happy to bow out of the answer because I'm a literary scholar, not a historian. But I do want to point to the work of Patrick Nunn. I think he's actually one of the few scholars that I've read who is both a scientist and environmentalist and has lived in the Pacific Islands for many years. He just left Fiji, where he was at USP, and is now in Australia. But he has a really great article that came out just a year ago where he says actually the history of sea level rise in the Pacific is 200 years old. And he said you actually can, if you look into the archaeology, you can see where people were, were moved from one area to another. And but of course, this is before the colonial bifurcation, where everyone then has to have a particular national, right, where the logic of citizenship actually roots people in places, that even if their island is being inundated. But that said, I think there's probably bigger challenge to that because sea level rise the ocean is so enormous and it's not consistent, right? So it's a major issue in the Western Pacific. It's not so much an issue in Hawaii, although I know that there's a lot of erosion happening, particularly on Big Island. So I think there's, I guess in fitting and talking about oceanic studies, you couldn't have a homogeneous narrative that all the sea was rising, right? It would be very contextual, and it really would take an embedded kind of focus on the kind of archaeology and the history and the kind of very interdisciplinary work that I think oceanic studies demands.
Yeah, apparently when Greenland or the Antarctic melts, it displaces water there, and so it doesn't rise so much, but on the other side of the Earth, it goes way up.
The tropics are actually the ones who are at the forefront, and the more and more studies are coming out about this. Number one is that the tropics, which is why these islands themselves are having so much trouble, is that because they've all their ecologies are within a 15-degree radius, and so once you start with the ocean acidification and then the thermal expansion of the oceans, then you really create these radical changes for the non-human life, right? So already you're going to have, the fishing impacts and all the other kind of things that are going to result from that.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. These were just fabulous. And thank you to everyone today. I feel like I learned so much. And just a couple comments and thoughts. I mean, one thing was, we've been talking about troubling the land-sea distinction. And the presentations, of course, really, made me think, obviously thinking about land, sea, sky, and depths, but especially with the Pacific. And I'm forgetting, is it Hawaii?
Hau'ofa.
No. Halloway. This celestial realm. Susan mentioned it. That. Anyways, it's beyond the sea and the sky. Beyond the sea and the land. what was it?
Oh, Hawaii, which is
thank you.
the afterlife as well as the origin.
Yeah,
Yes.
but also thinking about the celestial realm here, because I remember one of the first books I ever read about the Pacific was East is a Big Bird, which is all about
Yes.
the navigation by the stars and so on. But adding that realm in, I'm sorry, I couldn't remember the word. That was just a comment. But the discussion, what Juan has brought up, and you brought up, Liz, about salinization. So, I mean, there's this whole other, in addition to the kind of oceanic literature, elsewhere people talk about a water return. And a lot of that literature doesn't refer to the oceanic stuff, but it's about fresh water, the water wars, so these seem like points of intersection, really, to bring, because it's surprising how those bodies of scholarship, the oceanic and the water returns, often move on very different tracks, and yet, of course, they're intersecting. I mean, they're intimately related and intersecting very dramatically in places like the Pacific Islands. And finally, just one thing about, it's not the Pacific, it's the Indian Ocean, but this documentary, The Island President,
Yes, about the
which
Maldives.
many people saw, seems interesting because not only do we have a political story about, I mean, I know it's it probably should be complicated, the democratization of an authoritarian regime, but we see this place, that unsettles our notion, because of course the Maldives, this central island, is the most densely populated urban environment in the world, or one of them, right? So it really plays against the kinds of images that you showed us.
Exactly,
but
exactly.
I don't know how, I mean, it seems like these are really the exceptions. I don't know if in Indian Ocean documentaries there are these similar tropes besides this Island President.
I don't know. The only one I know is The Island President, which I think is a great film. And I should say I also teach all these films in my classes. I mean, they're both informative, and then they also, what I'm trying to point out is the narrative tropes, rather than to dismiss them altogether, even though it's very tempting. So, but I'm glad you brought up The Island President, because I think it's in the film. But when that former Prime Minister Nasheed had held his cabinet meeting underwater, right? And I think there's a whole other way of adding depth, right? They're talking about going below the surface in terms of kind of re-territorializing it in a way, but also calling attention to, the kind of the future of the Maldives. Moving backwards from your comments on freshwater, I think it's a really interesting comment, because what I've noticed, because my stuff is so much more focused on the maritime, it's a whole separate field to then be talking about freshwater and questions about water sovereignty. And so I haven't really seen people bringing them together. It seems that the conferences are either kind of oceanic, maritime, or they're freshwater sovereignty, the privatization of our public water system, things like that. So, and again, that's another area that needs to be developed. And then the final comment I'll make, moving backwards to your comment about Hawaii and about these ideas of kind of also celestial space. Actually, the project that I'm going to, this book is is a book about climate change, and the one I'm writing after this is looking at extraterritorial spaces like the ocean and the skies, and thinking through the way, on the one hand, they work really well, the ocean especially, in terms of thinking through going beyond the nation and kind of fluidity and mobility. But what I want to bring back into the conversation, and I mentioned this earlier too, is about the territorialism of the sea, right? So at the moment that we're turning to this oceanic imaginary, we have this, 3 decades long UN Convention, the Law of the Sea, and its complete territorialization, right? And so there's actually nowhere on the globe where you can go where the ocean isn't territorialized. It's either understood as international waters, or it's coastal waters, or as EEZ. So there's all kinds of ways that the very systems of meaning that we're associating with the oceanic are actually antiquated, because they've been long territorialized since, who's the Dutch guy from... Grotius, yes, from Grotius onwards, right? And so some of the recent work I've been doing is actually about nuclear testing in outer space, and thinking through the space war and satellites and the kind of Apollo images of the Earth that come from the Cold War. And so what I'm doing, this other project, is trying to bring through these ideas of spaces that we understand as unmarked and unterritorialized, and then thinking through actually how heavily militarized they are, to bring that back into the picture.
Thank you. We'll await your analysis of gravity.
It's actually, that's the third space. You're good. Exactly, because, well, but it also was through the International Geographical Year. That's what brought us Sputnik, right? And so it's all the kind of science that was happening in Antarctica, which was based on going to outer space. So Antarctica became this, again, extraterritorial space. And the treaties for the Outer Space Treaty, the Maritime UN Convention on the Law of the Sea Treaty, and then the Antarctic Treaty are all based on the idea of the commons, of having them as peaceful purpose. They're borrowed from each other. So there's a direct juridical connection between all three of them.
Well, thank you for a really interesting talk, and thanks to everybody. I'm sort of an isolato from the architecture school, and so it's kind of a treat to be able to come down here and hear what you'll have to say. During everybody's talk, I felt that there were a lot of parallels between these kind of maritime islands and the sort of landlocked, mountain-bound islands that I'm looking at, namely these small villages in mountainous Japan that are declining in population. And there are a lot of the same narratives of loss and environmental transition as a crisis, and also like the loss of cultures or like pure national traditions that have been isolated from the rest of the world. And so I think there's a lot in common here, and I'm curious about those narratives and their alternatives in, especially in these Pacific islands, where it's in the sort of like idea of extinction as necessarily a bad thing. Like, it's taboo to say, for example, that an animal species will go extinct, or that a community will disappear. And I assume that it's also uncomfortable to talk about the reality that these islands very well may disappear. And I wonder how that plays into the planning for the future, and whether there are discussions about, like, well, we would rather not sink if we can, but knowing that this may happen, this is what we're going to do about it. And does that affect their identity, their everyday life, and also their planning for the future in, cultural or spatial or whatever terms?
Great question. Two things to say just about this whole narrative of loss and loss of the pastoral, or loss of a kind of non-capitalist or less capitalist economy or culture. Some of the work I didn't go back to, but Raymond Williams' Country in the City, and then Leo Marx's Machine in the Garden, I think are two really key texts that have kind of really theorized out what this relationship is between technology and the pastoral, and then that idea of kind of lamentation, right, and the elegy that produces. So those are two texts I'd recommend if you haven't seen them. And then your question about the future, I mean, it's so complicated, because if you notice that Kathy Jetnil-Kushner, she says we don't want to leave, right? And I think she's working against the primary narrative that's happening coming out of the Pacific, particularly driven by Australian filmmakers and scholars and journalists, is that it's all about environmental refugees, which actually has no legal standing. There's no such thing as an environmental refugee, but that discourse keeps coming around, and people are finding it. Now, Anote Tong and some of the other major leaders from these atolls are talking about migration with dignity, because they want to move away from this idea of being refugees. But it's very complicated, because Australia is not in support of the major climate mitigation, the carbon mitigation laws, because their economy is being driven by coal that they're sending to China. So if you see, as Australia is actually one of the superpowers in the Pacific, and then they're having this relationship with Kiribati, Tokelau, and Tuvalu, they actually have to work with Australia. So Australia has set aside adaptation monies for people then to be migrating. But then there's a huge controversy then in terms of where are you going to accept these people, and so one of the things that Tuvalu and Kiribati have actually been buying up land around the Pacific to relocate people. So Tuvalu, because they sold the TV, and made quite a lot of money, they actually are more fortunate in that sense, in that they have a disposable income. And so they've been using that money to train islanders in other kinds of work so that they can prepare to migrate to Auckland or to Sydney or to other places. And when I was in Fiji last summer, it was all over the news that Kiribati had bought an island there for relocating a lot of their people. So I think actually, to bring it back to island studies, Godfrey, this is something I meant to mention to you earlier. I think the climate change crisis has helped us think about the importance of differentiating between islands, right? Because the atoll cultures, Kiribati is going to Fiji, right? Fiji actually is not getting the same kind of threat to climate change because they're so much more mountainous and they have a whole different geological structure. So I think it also encourages us to think even geologically, right? What are the differences between these different islands, and then how that produces different environmental and then by extension political impacts. So it's to say, that doesn't really answer your question, but it's really complicated and it's a huge debate going on right now.
Well, Liz, this was a terrific paper, and the responses were also extremely suggestive and well-informed. I can't help but thinking, though, that some of these narratives are so embedded in a basic Christian structure of which ends with loss, destruction, end of the world, and so on, that we really need to pull back and have a more secular narrative to operate within. I really think that stretching both the breadth of perspective and the depth of perspective can be helpful here, because frankly, we don't know as much as we should about the long history of, for example, fish in the sea, or other dimensions of this long relationship between depletion and recovery. But, you know, Bolster's book isn't all about emptying out the sea. In fact, there's plenty of evidence of recoveries. And in his book, he doesn't take a position or a judgment in the end as to whether we're really seeing the end time here. And I would also point out that a lot of the people who you might describe as environmental emigres or migrants are very happy to escape. I mean, we talk, you know, islands have been places to escape from for a very long time. And people have made choices to leave these places, and they didn't necessarily write elegies as they shipped out. So,
with you in California.
Yeah, sure they do. Sure they do. And my own feeling is that we need really a better kind of story of human mobility if we are not to fall into this kind of mourning and despair about the migrations that we're seeing today. Many of them are tragic, many of them are terrible, but many of them have been, in the long history of mankind, salvation. So that's what I would suggest. Maybe, I don't know, we may have a real disagreement here.
Are you prodding me into an argument?
Yeah, I am.
I mean, on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, I think the other aspect that I didn't get to go into in the analysis, and I think this speaks back to Susan's paper, is an indigenous concept of place and ancestral place that I think is not easily detachable. So even in the context, I think it's Time and Tide is one of the films that actually takes migrants who've gone to Australia and then they go back, right? And they visit the cemeteries, and it's all about the kind of history. And in every single one of these films, the flooding of the cemeteries is a major crisis point, right? Because it's the ancestors' bones there, and so there's a whole connection between your future burial place and your past burial place, right? And so this idea of kind of like a very material connection to the earth, but a very sacred connection. So I think on the one hand, while I don't want to dismiss the fact that mobility can actually be a very positive thing, and to pull people out of some of these commitments that Susan was talking about, certain webs of obligation that may feel quite stifling. On the other hand, I don't want to separate that out from an indigenous concept of place that's tied to genealogy, that's tied to self. And if you look at almost every line of Jetno Kushner's poem is, we are this, we are the land, we are the ocean, right? And so it's a very embedded sense of place that I think that makes that idea of mobility quite difficult.
We spoke about ontologies, we spoke about epistemologies. Perhaps we haven't spoken enough about methodologies. And this is, I think, one of the problems of perhaps essentializing the poem that we've heard. Once you go to the island, you're obviously going to hear people telling you that they want to stay. the people who don't want to stay are no longer there.
Yes. Or they're not interviewed, right? I mean, that's Carol Forbatko's critique. She says the journalists come in, they have a framework. Here are the 5 questions we're going to ask, and you need to respond to this idea that you're in crisis, it's apocalyptic, you don't want to go, right? And probably that is the majority response, but it doesn't include all of the other concerns that the people in these atolls may have.
And it has to be also the right type of crisis. It shouldn't be too critical of a crisis, because if it's too critical, it may work against you.
Mm-hmm.
The current president of the Maldives is now telling the world that we're not sinking, or at least we're not sinking as fast as Mohammed Nasheed told you. Because if the Maldives are disappearing, who in the heck is going to invest in the Maldives, right?
Exactly. Yes. Yep. Oh, so glad you made that point in your paper, because I see that also in the Marshall Islands, because there's one of the interviews where he does say this is terrible, but then he says, but we're still have this great tourist industry, so come, right? So there is this sense of ambivalence, right? But then the people who are coming are actually contributing to the problem by flying across the Pacific in order to then visit this quote-unquote dying culture. I mean, that's the irony too of a lot of these Marshall Island nuclear test sites. I mean, Bikini Atoll is one of the biggest scuba diving sites now, and that's how they're marketing it, because you can't live there because the cesium and the strontium are still in the ecosystems, but you can scuba dive and see the wrecks at the bottom of the reef. And so there are ways that this is becoming tourism. Then it's like disaster tourism, right? Is the new? I think it might be, actually. I should check.
Okay, I want to thank, first of all, our speakers, our discussants, great work. I want to thank Pat Lord for organizing this, and the visitors know that she's done a great job. And,
yes.
And all of the International Institute staff that helped on this, the program and the setup and the IT guys and everybody. So I want to, I'm really grateful for the wonderful staff we have at the Institute. Pat, you did wonderfully. So this is the end of our official day of meetings, and those of you who are guests and discussants, make sure you get the information on dinner, where it is tonight, and so forth. The rest of you go have a wonderful Friday and weekend. Not that, again, just like lunch. Not that we would love to have you, but we do have budget constraints. And so thanks. And next year, about a year from now, there'll be another symposium on another topic at the International Institute. And so this is great. Thank you, and good day.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ken.